Okay, thank you all for joining the GEP webinar, the new tech capabilities you need to balance costs, risk, and sustainability. Just a quick housekeeping note, if you have any questions during the webinar, please enter them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Also, we will be sharing the recording of this webinar afterwards, so no worries there. I'm honored today to be joined by our guest speaker from Forrester, Jeffrey Rajamani, and two of my esteemed colleagues from GEP's advisory consulting team, Mudith Kumar and Vengat. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
So let me take a few minutes, if I may. The last few years have really been challenging for supply chain and procurement pros. From having to react to pandemic-related disruptions to geopolitical flashpoints and extreme weather phenomenon. Unfortunately, all the indicators point that the rest of the year will continue to be very much the same. A pattern of high inflation, fears of recession, and volatile macroeconomic conditions. And expectations for procurement and supply chain teams to perform are at an all-time high. So workload is continuing to increase by double digits, but with lower headcount and operating budget, creating a large productivity gap coupled with efficiency gap. So naturally, the question for supply chain and procurement pros who are actually taking this responsibility on to navigate their companies through these obstacles is how can we quickly boost top and bottom line performance, sustain and extend business operations while continuing to meet customers' needs? Well, according to the latest GEP Economist and Impact Survey, this was conducted over 400 supply chain and procurement professionals. Rising costs, supply chain risks and disruptions, and sustainability remain the top challenges. So organizations often face many competing demands, but in today's environment, cost seems to again be the top focus. Taking actions to protect margin as revenue declines, or forcing procurement to quickly drive out costs. But is reacting to short-term fluctuations really the best strategy? I would contend that history has shown us that indiscriminately cutting costs is not the best strategy in the long run, and perhaps may do more harm than good. If market changes are happening this fast, isn't it entirely possible that a turn in the business cycle may actually cause a company to miss out on growth opportunities? So what type of strategy should be considered for your business to strike the right balance between cost pressures, risk, and the mid to longer term sustainability goals? And can organizations really harness intelligent technology to respond faster, plan better, ensure that their supply chain operations are actually operating as effective as they can be, given all these changing market dynamics? So with that presence in mind, let me turn to our guest speakers to get some deeper insight. So Jeffrey, can you please give us an update on rising costs? How are companies actually positioning themselves to handle these rising costs and inflation?
Thanks, Raj. First of all, thanks for having me here today on this webinar. Let me start this way. I was actually meeting up with a retail giant here in Europe, where I'm based, last week. I met up with the entire procurement function. There were category managers, chief procurement officer, and his entire team. So, you know what they told me? They told me that they have been told to cut costs fast. Now, they were also alluding to the fact that they were faced with reduced resources. And when I was continuing the conversation with them, they talked about manual processes, long winding processes. And for the first time, I ever heard of a term called team burnout. So I was like a little bit shocked, but when companies do talk of cost cuts, they are facing inflationary pressures. There's also a looming recession, but it's important to say procurement must act. Procurement must acknowledge and also act. So, I mean, there are various ways in which procurement can actually use this opportunity in the phase of, let's say, a C-level request or a CFO or CEO coming and saying cut down costs. You could resort to various mechanisms. So, favorable terms and conditions like discounts, negotiating of long-term contracts, alternative sources, look for more competitive bids, make your sourcing events more competitive, and then there are ways in which you can look for alternative, cheaper sources, and then weigh in more supplier attributes. One thing that stands out among all this is how do you kind of bring in automation? This team that I met last week, they had less people, but they had more work. There was a pressure to do more with less. So there are, Forrester keeps doing the survey, and we found out that, key actions that organizations are taking when it comes to reducing costs is, cut marketing costs, all the non, core divisions costs, reduce workforce, move from a capex to an opex model, and so on and so forth. So there are various ways in which we can approach, and I think one good step to start is, as I mentioned, acknowledge and take steps. Maybe it could be manual repetitive tasks could be automated, and rogue spend when it comes to travel and expenses could be removed, removing of human risks and so on. So this is what I see that is the best way forward before we talk about what next. But let me now pass it to Mudit and say, is this also what he sees in the market? Mudit, what are you seeing there?
Hey, Jeffrey. Thanks for queuing me in, and welcome to all our audience today. I'm sure this is a topic that's top of mind for a lot of you. And from my standpoint, what I'm seeing is probably a little bit of a shift from timeline perspective. I'll cover that. And also slight nuance by industry that we are also seeing. So let's talk about the shift in the timeline in the beginning. Let's start with that, right? So if we dial the clock back 10 months, we were reeling with inflation. In the US, many cities topped inflation at 9, even 10%. And then national inflation was also very, very high single digits, right? So very tough business scenarios got aggravated by some extra flush of cash in the system, plus a lot of supply chain issues. Now, bringing the dial back to where we stand today, we don't have the same inflation now. However, what we see in many, many cases is clients coming to us and saying, oh, by the way, my costs went up, inflation went up, but they aren't just coming down, they just don't naturally come down. We all as procurement professionals have to work hard to kind of find ways and find opportunities to reset the dial a little bit. So again, I think from what we see, and again, I'll break it down into COGS versus SG&A. Most of our clients in direct materials, where they are buying like materials and things that go into the product, considered direct materials in the space, they are looking at really going the total cost of ownership route, really breaking down the different cost components of why they are paying a certain amount for a landed product, and then having some fact-based discussion with the suppliers saying that, well, happened, it went up, but now it needs to come down. And the magnitude of what it could be is something that they are actively negotiating. Now, mind you, this is not a space where you can easily switch your supplier partners. A lot of these relationships are very ingrained. You are considered partners in many industries: automotives, food, CPG, we do see a lot of transparency in pricing, a lot of open book pricing that is tied to indices. So instead of like looking at competitive due diligence, we are typically recommending that we parse out the cost in a bit more detail, use some of the advanced analytics, predictive modeling, and bring some of these things to life. That's where technology kind of again plays a big role. Now, if you think about SG&A, there I think you do have a little bit more leverage on which supply partners you work with, and an opportunity to go back in the market and try to maximize some of this recent softness, some of this, whether it's a little bit additional capacity in certain areas of logistics, certain services sectors, which were really burning hot like 6-8 months ago. They're not that hot right now, but what we constantly see is the pricing hasn't been calibrated yet. So maybe some opportunities to recalibrate pricing. But again, to manage some of that additional work, to run those scenarios, we do see companies leaning on certain digital tools. Source to pay kind of platforms really help how you approach the market in these cases. And then again, some of those digital tools like market intelligence, cost intelligence, scenario modeling tools, they really help you make more informed decisions. And then there is a variation across industries as well. So traditionally, there are industries in manufacturing which have always been struggling with inflation a little bit. And now they're looking to kind of capitalize on this trend. But the latest and greatest that we see is that Silicon Valley is starting to pay more attention to these trends as well. Like they are seeing the cost of capital go up. The multiples for the growth are not that high. So the pure play tech sector is also spending more time in terms of these cost management initiatives. So just a few quick thoughts from my side, but I would say exciting times for procurement professionals, a lot of opportunities, but we need to be armed with the right tools, the right approaches to make sure we can get the biggest bang for the buck. Jeffrey, I'll hand it back to you. I think we are dovetailing our thinking here. I know we talked a lot about cost, but we also recognize that that's one of the 3 pillars of what's most important to the business. Sustainability and ESG is constantly being called out as a top board level priority by different businesses. So I'll hand it back to Jeffrey and bring some of these recent findings to life, and let's hear, from you, Jeffrey, what you're seeing happening in the industry.
Oh, that's spot on, Mudit. Thanks for that. I mean, we have been, following the space. You talked about the business spend management, and you talked about the inflationary pressures. It's, when we look at the top priorities that organizations have these days, there are a plethora of priorities apart from cutting costs. But it's not just to, concentrate on costs. You need to pivot away into more mid and long-term measures, and that's what it's all about. So you kind of ride over the storm because of the inflationary pressures, but set your sight on more, forward-looking mid to long-term measures for the, prepare. Organizations should prepare for the long haul. So that is where sustainability comes into play. We kind of asked about the priorities of companies, business priorities of companies, and invariably in each of the surveys that we do, we see that sustainability is got a role to play. So no longer is sustainability just a statement in the earnings call where a CEO or a CFO mentions saying that, we want to be net zero by this year, or we are looking into sustainability, we are expanding our CSR, corporate social responsibility, to now become ESG. But now we see a real walking the talk happening. So there was the survey that we did when we asked some respondents. Raj, if you can just move to the next slide. We asked about 5,000 business and technology professionals. When it comes to business objectives, there were plenty of other business objectives as well. But when we wanted to deep dive on sustainability, in specific on environmental sustainability, we asked, over the next 12 months, what would be the, a critical or a high priority? It was pretty insightful. The study came out that, across industries, here you see financial services, insurances, manufacturing industries, and also globally, almost a third of the respondents, almost 2/3 of the respondents said that they are going to keep sustainability as a critical or high priority. So this cannot be a mere statement in an earnings call. It's much beyond that. They need to kind of now start really looking into the emissions that are happening. This was particularly on the environmental sustainability. So they need to kind of start putting teams into place, having science-based targets. And I have seen that over several industries, there are targets that are defined. There has also been a new role, that's Chief Sustainability Officer, coming into play. But one thing that stands out is, procurement is called out to kind of drive and run with the sustainability agenda. So this will kind of really pivot from what we talked about, the costs, into much more saying, for the long haul, how do you prepare companies to not just be successful, but to be better companies for the future? And that's what it's all about. So I mean, yeah, Raj, you want to?
No, yeah, Vengat. No, Vengat, I know it's interesting. We talked about sort of the E, Jeffrey sort of mentioned there, and then there's sort of the regulations and proposed regulations that are coming into order here. So Vengat, maybe you can provide us a little bit of background and what this means to companies in terms of effect and compliance, et cetera.
Sure, Raj, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I think, like my colleague said, Jeffrey, like the ESG legislation is white hot. Although, like almost all the OECD countries, like they have come up with their own legislations. At the end of the day, the goal is to achieve net zero, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. The front runner was the Germany's Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Although they were the first one to come up with this, the USA came up with like a lot of other acts related to the ESG practice, notably the Inflation Reduction Act. Sizable incentives. It's almost the incentives are ranging from 30 to 70% of your tax benefit. The Forced Labor Prevention Act. There are a lot of efforts happening in terms of providing a proof of third-party audit, meaning like earlier it used to be more about the individual companies submitting an audit report, but now it's more about like the third parties. This is the item is sourced especially for like cocoa, or the next one followed by the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, which is specifically targeted to the China's Xinjiang region. Your cotton, a lot of mining happens over there. So those are predominantly targeting how can we contribute to all three things, the E, S, and G, in terms of how do we better build a nation, how can we consume the right materials, across the entire supply chain. Earlier, it used to be more focused on the tier one. Now, the crux is getting to know about the entire supply chain from your tier one to the tier N. There are a couple of things over there. what happened. I think COVID, the pandemic, made us brought this to the light. Like earlier, it used to be more about like focus on your tier one and get to know more about the tier one. But it so happened that most of your tier ones were buying it from the same supplier who are at high risk, who are located in the high risk area. So those are brought us to the light, and what it means for us is to understand the entire supply chain, and it also helps to manage the risk, which my colleagues will talk it in a little bit. So essentially what we wanted to mention is like the ESG legislation is white hot, and the goal for us is all to drive the sustainability. And what it also makes us do is, there is no, I think I think Mudit mentioned, or maybe Jeffrey mentioned, that risk, sustainability, and cost reduction, everything goes hand in hand. Like, it's a three legs of the stool. So when cost reduction happens, it drives sustainability investment. And when you start focusing on sustainability, when you start reducing the carbon footprint, you are reducing transportation, you're using recycled materials. So that's going to help you in reducing cost. So it's almost like a circular effect. Maybe the next slide will talk more about, are we leveraging the technology? Can we go to the next slide, Raj, please?
Mm-hmm.
Are we leveraging the technology, both hardware and software, in terms of managing the sustainability? Very surprising to note that less than 20% of the companies, 1 in 5 companies, are using anything related to software. Like, mostly like the scope 1 and 2 and even 3 is largely ignored. Although most of the companies' emission is contributed by scope 3, we lack considerably in terms of even understanding those data. I think, like, most of the companies keep talking about the goals of being net zero by 2040 and 2040 and 50. But if you peel and look at short-term and mid-term goals, it is not strong. It is not really about being net zero in 2040 or 50. It is more about the roadmap. What are the short-term, mid-term goals? A lot of those are done through the leveraging the cross-functional team, leveraging the data. So that's where, like, we feel the companies are more talking today, and the actions are, I would say probably the actions are still yet to be very prominent. Like the survey indicates, less than 1 in 3, less than 1 in 5 companies have any interest in utilizing or leveraging the technology, and data being a key role in understanding your current landscape. It is much more important for the companies to take a look at what are their available technologies and how can it be leveraged. And that's an area which we still need to go leaps and bounds. That'll help, like I said, that'll help in cost savings. That'll also help in the risk side of things, where my colleagues will continue talking about. Over to you, Raj.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting, right? So the question is, where do you go from here, and how quickly, and how important it is to quickly understand that this is the way to get there, right, in that longer term. Jeffrey, I wanted to clue you back in here. I know you had some additional comments here, and so could you maybe elaborate here from your perspective what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely, Raj, and thanks to Mudit and also to Venkat for these thoughts. I fully agree with you. See, legislations are done in a way at this point of time is it kind of prompts companies to get up from the seat and do something, act. Over a period of time, legislations would be there, but companies would get that into their system, and they don't need any more legislations to remind them or be wary about, and that's where it's heading. In fact, just yesterday I was listening to the radio, and I heard that what Venkat referred to the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. The German name is a very complicated, almost I think 36 letter word. Can you imagine 36 alphabet word? It's that. So it's called Lieferketten Pflichtengesetz. So I think one of the first cases is already coming up to the German government to scrutinize this. Companies like Amazon, I think IKEA and Tom Taylor, they have been kind of put under the lens. This is because these three companies are using Bangladesh for manufacturing of some of their equipment or some of the logistics, and they found out, or at least the case is that there have been unfair trade practices and also labor rights violation in the factories in Bangladesh. I mean, 10 years ago, we all know that there were massive problems. Almost people died because of bad working conditions in Bangladesh. And now, not much seems to have happened in the last 10 years. And now this is the first case for this German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act that they are now auditing to see what is the truth in there. So basically, my point is European Union is pretty active considering the introduction of this. They're active in the E of the ESG. They plan to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, okay, that would tilt the economies of scale in favor of companies that have lower carbon emissions. So that's one. Governments have other legislations that they use to strengthen forced labor. I think Moritz talked to that, Venkat talked to that about it. UK, for example, the government has toughened its laws on modern slavery. There are hefty fines actually if you violate these. 2% of the global revenues is at stake. Now, if I were to just summarize all this, sustainability is not about just doing the right things and reducing risks. It's more about being better companies. Okay, if companies get it right, they can not just increase their sales, they can increase their profitability, but also they can decrease their capital costs. That's very important. There are other inherent benefits, and companies that do well in ESG scores. I mean, Venkat talked about scope 1, 2, and 3. I mean, they could also attract good talents, in these days of labor shortages and so on. So ESG factors are placed very high when people, choose a company for their job. So there is actually a race to net zero with E of the ESG, but S and the G have really a very crucial role to play. It's not just about that, that intergovernment panel on climate change. That's very important because it talks about, requesting CEOs to deliver on your promise. But there's much more happening on the ground there.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, Jeffrey, in terms of that, right? And so I think we should turn to our third topic here that Venkat alluded to as well, which is about risk, right? And so, how can companies really factor in the risk piece and build supply chain resilience into that equation? What type of risks should they most be concerned about? Jeffrey, maybe let's start with you there, and then see what Mudit can provide his perspective as well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, with the supply chain crisis, most C-level executives, put risk mitigation, risk avoidance, and resiliency right on top. I mean, when you talk about risk, it depends on each company what would be risk for them. There is operational risk, business continuity risk, like the supply chain risk that we saw, strategic risk, regulatory compliance risk, financial risk, environmental sustainability risks, reputational related risks. I mean, there are a plethora of risks that market volatility risks and so on. A plethora of risks out there. It's the question of how companies are able to kind of navigate the changes by minimizing the risk, at the same time maximizing the value that matters. I mean, if you look at some anecdotal examples of what we have seen in the market, just imagine, I'm based in Germany, so let me start with some German examples. We did see that Intel, the chip manufacturer, didn't want to put all its eggs in one basket, meaning to say in Asia, and started looking at facilities in Eastern Germany. And today that project has caught up momentum at an exponential rate. Another chip manufacturer in Germany is Infineon, is looking at again another facility in East Germany. Let's stay with chip manufacturing. There's a company, TSMC, one of the largest chip manufacturers in the world. They said, we are in Asia, but still we don't want to be caught with the supply chain risk. They are setting up a 12 billion plant in Arizona. And then just about a month, or maybe 2 months ago, I just heard that, with electric batteries becoming more and more in vogue for electric cars, there is this battery giant, a Chinese battery giant, CATL. They are setting up, operations in Arnstadt in Europe. I mean, and then again, I mean, I don't know. I want to switch back a little to legislation part. There's the Inflation Reduction Act that actually, US came up with, and the EU is trying to have something very similar. But all these are, to kind of tide over those risks, but at the same time have the big picture and make their businesses all more sustainable. So how you could not just promote American companies by this Inflation Reduction Act, but also see that you are meeting the net zero challenges that you see. So it's all about moving from what I call, it's not when, it's not an if, but it's a question of when. It's not a question of just in time, but it's a question of just in place. How do you kind of move, keeping those risk reduction measures, risk avoidance measures, and pivot yourself? How do you manage supplier related risks, reduce it where possible, tolerating it where necessary? But these business spend management solutions, how do they manage this initial risk? And not just manage it, but kind of have an ongoing monitoring and prompting action, so that there is no disruption or an infringement on the sustainability, the ESG policies. I think that's what is the shift that we are seeing in the market today when it comes to risk.
Great, Jeffrey. Mudith, I know you have some specific strategies and examples as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeffrey, thank you for painting the paradigm shift that we have seen. So I think very, very true. Just in time to just in case probably has resonated with a lot of different people and kind of brings the point home on what the pandemic has done in terms of our thinking, right? So I think where I'll pick up from there, I think you articulated the business context very well, both in terms of geographical variations too. I think I'll probably touch on a couple of key points. One is supply chain risk, supplier risk, third-party risks, different terminologies that different industries tend to use. So if I could take just a moment to articulate just some variations in vantage points in where different industries come into this topic from. And then let's talk about like what is the call to action. I mean, we can probably all agree, us four and hundreds of participants in this call, it's an important topic, but I think rubber hits the road when we start thinking about, okay, what do we do, right? So I mean, that's where the challenge is. So let's talk about the industries first. So I'm sorry, Raju, go ahead, you were saying something.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's how do I take that action, right? This is all great, we understand, but where do I get started, right?
Yeah, so if you think about industries, right? So let's start with something that doesn't fit the traditional definition of supply chain. Let's start with financial services first, where supply chain risk is it's not really like manufacturing and logistics supply chain, but more from the vantage point of third-party risk management, TPRM. And I'm sure like some of our participants and colleagues today who are closer to that industry, they probably know that this is something that was in the US heavily regulated starting 2013 with the OCC guidelines. And that forces a lot of investment in this space. Whereas very clear regulation, you have to have very clear mitigation and structure against it. And a lot of companies in last decade or so have invested in organizational capabilities, digital capabilities to truly track and manage where their third parties are, what kind of data do they consume, what does it mean for their customers. And you can imagine, some of the largest banks out there, the kind of information they have. And naturally, banks are not like IT experts. So they will lean on third-party providers to bring in those services, that infrastructure. But at the end of the day, that extended third-party network then again has access to some very, very sensitive information. So then there are these right controls, right checks and balances to make sure that third-party risk is managed appropriately. Now, if we kind of move to another industry, couple other industries, let's take an example, right? So other type of regulated industries, let's say food, let's say pharma, you start to think about, well, from a transparency perspective. So when you seem to have any type of issues with the product, then track and trace becomes super, super important, like absolutely critical in pharmaceutical space, especially as you think about your clinical trial supply chain. So even before the product gets out, there is an entire supply chain that manages and promotes clinical trials. And you have single blinded, double blinded studies, which make it even harder to kind of go in and track for the right reasons, No, we don't want people to tamper with the results, but at the same time, that makes our job as supply chain professionals harder. And then when you're mass producing some of these life-saving drugs at massive scale, then the complexity is even bigger with a vast footprint. So a lot of investments in digital technology in that space, as you think about how do you drive supply chain transparency, but at the same time, like how do you then start to also mass produce at scale? And that's where you see the second bullet here, like collaboration. So how do you dynamically collaborate with your supplier down to the level of you're not just sending a PO and then saying, hey, it's your problem, get me this stuff at a certain date. You're sharing your production schedules, their production schedules, creating ability to kind of making those changes in a real life. And then using very, very strong AI and machine learning layers to it, right? So we can all probably recognize that we can create the right consulting frameworks. I mean, of course, we are in the business, so we love doing that. But to sustain this over time, we need some more support from technology, some more help in like decision engines, different scenarios where we are lacking, strong notification if anything changes. Again, like tactical call to actions for planners and collaborators in the supply chain, both on the manufacturer side as well as on the supplier side, to make that agility and alignment happen. I think those are the next two pillars called out here. So that becomes very important. And if I take another example from, let's say, food industry, which is, and again, tying back to what Venkat said, it all tends to come together. So a lot of emphasis on food industry in non-GMO, locally sourced, origin of source in certain food products, Coffee is a great example. A lot of companies want to say where their coffee beans come from, and that has a certain market value from it, right? So how do you track and trace the origin of certain food products if you're not directly going to the source becomes critical. And then again, it goes back to how closely we are able to track and trace supply chain visibility, collaborate with our suppliers. And again, if we have, God forbid, any kind of issues, then quickly being able to take those items off the shelf and take remediation actions. It shouldn't be like this long drawn process of like, okay, what do we do? And then as some of you might relate to it, especially in sensitive industries, pharma, food, CPG, companies that tend to err on the side of caution and make wholesale decisions on what they want to kind of take off market and throw out, right? So that also has a big cost to it. So I think a lot of these factors come to life, like I said, different vantage points, but we do see very strong digital application needs. We also, I think this is a very, very strong kind of moment in time. All of us are seeing how regenerative AI, aka like ChatGPT style solutions, are changing the world. We also see like AI becoming more and more stronger in generally a lot of different applications. You all see Cortana on different notifications. So we as a company that prides itself in bringing some of these functional core expertise together, data sciences together, and then bringing some of these AI solutions together, we strongly feel that now is the time where we can actually do something about these issues with help from bringing our functional expertise together. So we are attacking the right issues, but also heavily leaning on the digital solutions powered by AI and machine learning to bring in some of these tools and help us, aid us in this ongoing decision making. These are like millions of data points to process. Like I said, it's like, okay, we can all agree visibility is an issue, but what does that mean? It means tracking geographies, suppliers, SKUs, multiple ingredients, multiple suppliers. Very quickly you run into like millions of combinations of these different factors. It's even with the best intentions, very difficult for us to process it all. So I think what we are seeing is more and more of our clients taking those tangible steps to kind of take some of these elements, of course, starting with what's the most teething issues for your particular enterprise, but then kind of setting the right frameworks, organizational capabilities, and leaning on some new digital tools to make a change for future. So I'll take a pause there. I know I probably threw a lot of information at you, but I'll circle back with our group here, see if we have any more comments, and then we can move forward. Go ahead, back to you, Raj, Jeffrey, Vengat. Anything else you might?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mudit. I think you rounded it up very nicely, so thank you. Yeah, Jeffrey, Vengat, any comments from your end?
Yeah, maybe just one, one point to circle back on what Mudit said. Like especially the digital acceleration has the digital utilization has accelerated in the risk management area. Like as much as we saw in the sustainability 1 in 5 companies, when it comes to the utilization of tools in terms of the risk management, there is a lot of proliferation, almost like not very sophisticated tool, but like many of the automotive companies and many of the manufacturing companies have the most complex supply chains, and especially the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the traceability in the food industry enabled the utilization of digital tools. And there are so many tools which have come to track the supply chain, map the supply chain. As Mudit said, it's extremely complex. It very quickly gets into the millions of suppliers and millions of SKUs and the combinations. So, and what is more important is like, if you don't follow, if you don't track or trace, there are many instances where the goods are held by the customs. For example, like, one of my clients who's in the automotive industry, there was an element of doubt if that material was coming from the Uyghur region. they didn't have enough evidence. So almost in 8 locations, the production was stopped for almost a week. So what it means is, like, very quickly other companies recognized the issue they had in the hand, and, like, they started building a tool in joint collaboration among themselves. So it's forcing, these legislations are forcing. So hopefully the practice in the EU directives and the SEC in the US made it very it's almost mandatory for companies to report on scope 1, 2, and 3. So that will also help. That will also help to the proliferation of the digital tools. That's pretty much I had, Raj.
Yeah, it's a good point, Vengat. I think the big question then is, if you don't start to take action and you wait for this regulation to come in, right, till it's fully baked, where would you be in terms of your competitive advantage, right? I mean, I think that's the problem with waiting. Jeffrey, additional comments from you?
Yeah, I think it's good that as I mentioned earlier, that companies are forced to get up from the seat thanks to that looming legislation. But over a period of time, I mean, legislation would nudge you to kind of do something, but it should be part and parcel of the way you start thinking about your businesses. I think Mudit or Venkat even talked about redesigning your entire processes. This is the time, it's an inflection point, Raj. It's actually an inflection point. You need to put through every processes through a lens and relook at it, not just for the short haul, but really for the long haul. And I think that's what it's all about.
Great. Well, this has been extremely insightful, and I know we have a few minutes before we take some questions. So I think I'm hoping that everyone that's listening here, the audience, is able to take some of these learnings back to the organization to start really getting away from just being reactive, but actually through planning a methodical, strategic approach to basically align their business outcomes with the value, right? So investing in sustainability and risk mitigation now will help to improve everything from efficiency and productivity, and actually deliver the better outcomes to a competitive advantage. But again, I think the key here is really the new intelligent technology that is in the market and still being developed in these new tools, I think, that Mudit referred to, and Vengat. Real-time visibility, the ability to be agile, right, with automation, AI, embedded analytics, centralized processes and operations, and actually automated workflow, right, to be able to help with that orchestration and be able to actually respond very quickly is very important. And then the predictive capabilities, I think we touched on that a little bit, but being able to get sort of the forecast and insights from all of these different sources, right? Structured data, unstructured data. How do we take that data? How do we cleanse that data and be able to develop a spend and category strategies that can actually optimize and not just reduce costs? So taking both the historical spend data, predictive spend data, I think Mudit mentioned this in terms of the intelligence, right? Market intelligence, cost intelligence, supplier intelligence, to actually create strategy that is proactive for execution. And then collaboration on the last piece of this. I know the team touched on this as well. But being able to create more value out of your suppliers and trading partners over time for both innovation, quality, and resilience will go a long way in actually achieving these goals. Okay, great. I think we have 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask the presenters one more time. Any last thoughts or comments for the audience here?
I just at one point you talked about this predictive part. So we talked about business spend management tools as well. So there are real-time alert up, as we call it. It should be no longer drill down. You don't have to double click and deep dive into the cause of, let's say, a risk or the cause of a disruption, but it should be alerted up. And I think these predictive tools are also there, and you need to leverage technology to get it. Because if something is happening in the rainforest in Malaysia, how do you get, the clients get to know that in real time? That's what matters. And I think there is no other option but to rely on technology.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeffrey. Absolutely. Okay, I think we have just a few minutes left, so I wanted to see if there were any questions from the audience. Okay, so we do have one question coming in here. The question is, are the strategies that you noted today different for smaller firms or those organizations that have smaller procurement teams than they would be for sort of the larger ones? So how can they get and think more strategically about their supply chain? Mudit, maybe you can take this one.
Happy to. So I think these are absolutely critical points for even companies with a smaller footprint. Now, what we see in the market is a couple of key trends for smaller firms. I think the challenge is obvious, like it does become slightly more challenging if you have limited spend to play with. Sometimes that generates limited value. So business case needs a little bit more refinement. But what we typically see is clients being a little bit more mindful about key capabilities that they build in-house, because you do want to focus on building those capabilities for the most critical parts of the business. And then they kind of buy or borrow capabilities as needed. I think a lot of these new cloud-based solutions also allow you to still get the digital capabilities in your environment with your ownership of how much complexity you want to drive, more customizations, bells and whistles. But it's easier to tap into some of the new age cloud solutions without breaking a bank, so to say. So I think I would encourage all our colleagues with medium-sized companies to evaluate and look at these options, there is a plethora of those in the market today.
Thank you. Okay, I see another question here. Why are companies finding it a challenge to engage in more Scope 3 emissions reduction initiatives? Maybe Venkat, can you touch on that one, please?
Sure, Raj. That's actually a hot topic. Many of my clients are early in the process, and those are like Fortune 500, Fortune, Global 2000 companies. But it is more applicable for all the companies. Like it's there are many challenges for us to get involved in terms of managing these Scope 3 emission initiatives. The first and foremost is lack of control and influence. Scope 3 contributes more than 85-90% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and predominantly it is contributed from the procured goods and services, which you don't have control per se through your company. Although you have to rely on many hundreds and thousands of suppliers. So that's the first big challenge, and then the next followed by the complexity and data availability. Like I said, thousands of suppliers, and what data to collect. How do I have a baseline? Where do I collect the information from? So on and so forth. And lastly, the collaboration and coordination. Reducing Scope 3 or even managing Scope 3 doesn't happen in a four wall. You need to partner with engineering. You need to partner with manufacturing. There are the top quartile companies who are managing Scope 3 have started setting science-based targets with their top 20% suppliers. So similar, and when those suppliers come back to achieve their goals, you need to invest time, you need to invest resources in terms of hearing their ideas and working with them jointly in terms of It could be joint process improvement, or it could be like changing the design. Many things might come out of those, but we have to have the years and also resources to invest in those ideas. And overcoming these challenges is going to require a combination of leadership commitment, stakeholder engagement, data transparency, collaborative approach, and most importantly, supportive policies. So it's a complex task, but we need to get started somewhere. Raj.
Great, thank you, Venkat. I know we just have another couple of minutes. We talked a little bit about collaboration, and Jeffrey, there's a question here around effective collaboration and the process and what that would look like. Can you maybe elaborate on that for the audience here?
Oh, that's a great question. I think supplier collaboration is key, Raj. I mean, irrespective of the industry, categories, complexity, type of spends, or whatever, you need to unlock for more value from your suppliers, and that's very important. But it's not a one-way traffic. I see that it should be a win-win proposition. It's not that the client expects of the suppliers, but more so to Venkat's point, collaboration is both ways. You need to find out what makes them successful, be open for new ideas from them, because after all, they had worked with you. I see a term called co-creation, co-innovation very much in vogue, where suppliers, for example, with automotive companies, sit together and conceptualize their product. How can, that is the true strategic partnership and close collaboration for product development. And now ensure that, the sources of relationship frictions are all gone. And I think, and then you use technology. And I say technology should not just automate, but also prioritize and optimize. And if with this kind of mentality, if you work with suppliers, it would be kind of an unbeatable proposition that the client and the suppliers could work on.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, and then we have one last question here. Mudith, I'll turn to you. This is around the technology landscape. I know you talked a little bit about this in terms of some of that new technology and how that can help solve some of the challenges. So this particular question is, how do you think current technology landscape is positioned today, and how can that help solve some of the challenges that we've discussed so far in this? So it's kind of a loaded question, but any last thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for acknowledging. I think we can talk about that question for a few hours, but I'll try to summarize in quick 45 seconds. So I think one of the big changes in digital landscape, especially in our space, procurement and supply chain space, happened when a lot of providers moved from on-prem to cloud-based technologies, including GEP, being one of the front runners in this space. I think what I see like a big change happening right now is the true power of AI coming to the fore. I think it was just pure, I mean, simply said, it was at some point in time, it was just too expensive to have that kind of computing power. So we just, from a technological standpoint, we just weren't ready for regenerative AI, predictive modeling, scenario modeling. We did have some of that, but we weren't just able to process the kind of data we can process today. And then I think Jeffrey made an interesting comment earlier that we don't even have to process. The AI processes it for us and prompts us into certain decision scenarios to allow us to make some interesting decisions in our space, right? So I think that level of predictive modeling, the computing power that we have today, and a lot of companies are already using cloud-based solutions. So I think this is like a perfect coming of sorts of various different elements that really sets this stage up for, I would say, a huge acceleration in how companies deploy digital tools. So I'm very excited about next 3 years. I do anticipate a lot of movement in this space, a lot of companies jumping on this digital transformation journey. So exciting times.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Mudit. Thank you, Vengat and Jeffrey as well for joining us here. I think it's been very insightful. Some great questions from the audience as well. We will follow up as a reminder with a copy of the webinar recording as soon. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to being able to do this again in the future very soon. So thank you, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.